Hi! Women Leaders has grown into the age of sponsorship, and this episode is sponsored by the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, European Union. This important German foundation is affiliated with the National Green Party and the European Alliance 90, the Greens. With a strong commitment to ecology, gender democracy, equal rights for minorities, and empowering migrants, they advocate for a world that values equality. The Heinrich Böll Stiftung European Union represents the foundation in Brussels, actively shaping the future of the European project and its global role. For those interested in EU politics and policies, they're your go-to resource for information and engagement. And they are, of course, on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. All links are attached to the short notes of this podcast. Many thanks to the Heinrich Böll Stiftung European Union for supporting our podcast, which helps us bring ever more inspiring conversations with women leaders. All opinions expressed in this podcast reflect the views of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung European Union. Hello everyone, and welcome to WISE Brussels Voices and our series with women leaders. I'm Ilana Beitel. I'm a member of WISE Brussels, that's Women in International Security, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. The unfolding crises in the Middle East and Ukraine have kept us very focused on global disorder. But to really understand the full perspective, it's necessary to look beyond these regions. In our last full episode, we discussed the state of play in Latin America, and now we're going to Africa. Home to 54 states and over 1.4 billion people, it holds just over 18% of the global population and is perceived as the rising continent. Moreover, it is where Russia, China, the EU, and the US have great interests and are playing out part of their great power confrontations. We have with us two great women to discuss the importance of Africa and recent events within it. Dr. Comfort Ero, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group, and Dr. Nina Willen, Head of the Africa Program at the Egmont Institute. Welcome to you both. Comfort, it's extremely nice of you to join us on this podcast. Let's start as we always do. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your career and how you got to the dizzying heights that you have?
Thank you very much. And I appreciate joining you on the podcast. And it's also just very interesting to understand the platform that you generated, that it's about women who are doing things as opposed to always talking about women. So my name is Comfort Ero, the current President CEO of Crisis Group. It will be 2 years, the 24th of December, 2023, when I became president. I was before that the interim vice president, but primarily in Crisis Group, I was the Africa program director. I came back to Crisis Group. So I was at Crisis Group at the earlier years under Gareth Evans, the president from 1999 to about 2008. And when I first came to Crisis Group, I was focused on West Africa, sadly watching the developments that are unfolding there. Then I left and went to the United Nations mission in Liberia. I was very intrigued. I didn't want to get secondhand information. I'd spent a great deal of time analysing and thinking through pathways to peace there. So I wanted to be there to watch it unfold. And then I left Liberia after nearly 4 years of watching that peace process unfold. I went to again focus more sort of discreetly on a particular issue that had been at the back of my mind for a long time and which we had focused on in Crisis Group, which is transitional justice and the idea of how do you deal with accountability, grievances, root causes of grievances, and how do you deal with justice in the midst of trying to do conflict resolution. I stayed there for a few years in Cape Town, running the Cape Town office for the International Centre for Transitional Justice. And there I was the deputy for the Africa program. As I was thinking about my next journey, Crisis Group came knocking on the door and I came back and the rest is history. My background is grounded in international relations, politics and government, having studied all my life in London. my origins are Nigerian. My parents found each other in London, and then they birthed 3 children. We were brought up in our earlier years in Nigeria, which I think was vital for me to appreciate, and my brothers to appreciate, our parents' own story. And I think a lot of that, and being surrounded with my parents, their siblings, and being in Nigeria just as it was just after it ended its civil war, and was still dealing with the aftermaths of that. I think all of that informed where I am today. And just the final thing is that I grew up also at the end, sort of in the post-Cold War, and also at the time of the Rwandan genocide and end of South African apartheid. And I think all of these issues sort of played into decisions that I made that sort of shaped the choices that I've made in terms of my sort of career, professional, vocational path as well.
Thank you very much, Comfort. That was absolutely fascinating. And you raised many issues which I could spend a whole podcast talking about, not least the politics of transitional justice. Nina, I'm sure you too have a fascinating background. Can you tell us a bit about it, both your studies and your profession?
Sure. So I'm now the director of the Africa program at the Egmont Institute of International Relations in Brussels, which is an independent think tank, which is close to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it's independent academically. And we're doing research on topics that are that we have expertise on. We're also organizing seminars and conferences related to Africa in different ways. So topics that have some sort of connection to the African continent. And before that, I'm also associate professor in political science at Lund University in Sweden, where I also did my master's degree quite a few years back. And I've been working on different types of peace and conflict studies ever since the master's degree. So did a PhD in political science at the ULB, Université Libre de Bruxelles in Brussels, focusing on the military interventions in civil wars in Africa, in Liberia and Burundi more particularly. And then I continued to do postdoctoral research projects with different universities. So Antwerp University with the Military Academy in Brussels, the Royal Military Academy, and also Stellenbosch University in South Africa. So my research has always been focused in some ways on military interventions in Africa, mostly stabilizing intervention, what has been called stabilizing intervention. So peace operations, peacekeeping missions, or ways to stabilize a situation. So right now, my research is very much focused on security force assistance in the Sahel region in particular. Before that, it was in the Great Lakes region. So how external actors are trying to improve the capacities or capabilities of security forces in Africa is very much part of my research. And then I also look into the gender aspect of that. So how do we integrate women into the armed forces in different states, not just African states, but more globally? But I've been focusing on that in South Africa, Burundi, and also in the Sahel region in Niger and Mali.
Well, that's really, really, really impressive. And if nothing else, we could probably spend the next 3 hours with you two doing a deep dive into Liberia, where Comfort, as you know, has spent 4 years in the UN mission. So you could probably have a lot to talk about, but we're not going to go specific, at least not initially. We will remind our listeners that talking about Africa is rather weird, given there are 54 states and it is a huge continent. But maybe that is a starting point for people who don't really know that and don't really understand Africa. Why does it seem that there are various parts of Africa that are always in trouble and are always in the news, that Africa is not a quiet, easy continent? Comfort.
Well, I mean, it's, the continent is made up of 54 countries, and I mean, when you look at it, from its various regions, not everywhere is in crisis, and not everywhere is going through some kind of turbulence, and it's a pretty mixed picture. There are countries that are on a strong democratic path. There are countries that are pseudo democracies. They have the makings of, or the trappings of democracy, but yet the leaders are varying in a different direction. And of course, you have got leaders who have tilted to a more stronger authoritarian bend. There are countries that are in transition from years of turbulence and now trying to carve a more democratic path. And there are, the continent also has its major powers, superpowers. So classically, it used to be Nigeria, South Africa, still very much at the heart of that. But it used to be Egypt, Libya. But since Libya's sort of turmoil in 2011, it hasn't sort of been a sort of strong power in the same way. And you've got countries like Ethiopia and Algeria still very much there. And then rising middle powers like Kenya and Rwanda, who are also trying to shape peace and security on the continent. Now, we are talking at a moment where there have been a number of coups on the continent. So we have seen in the very first 2 decades of this century, for example, we've seen 13 successful coups that have taken place. But worryingly, astonishingly, for all of us who've been watching the continent, from August 2020 right through to now, as I speak to you, 2023, there have been 7 coups. 7 African leaders have been toppled by their own militaries. And a lot of this, even more worryingly, a lot of these military takeovers have been primarily sort of in this belt of instability that stretches from Niger to Sudan. And everybody's concern today is whether there's going to be any contagion as well. So contagion effect, or any domino effect. And everybody's speculating where the next coup is going to be. What is worrying, and this will be my final words, what is worrying is that the coups are taking place particularly in 3 countries where there's been strong international investment, so Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, often described as the southern neighborhood of Europe, and where we've seen strong European intervention, primarily led by France. And then right across the other side, you've got Sudan, also where there's been significant international attention. But what is sad about the Sudan situation particularly is that 2019, you saw a number of youthful demonstrations, protests, women particularly at the helm of that, young people at the helm of that, to topple over 30 years of a sort of dictatorship in the form of Omar al-Bashir. And to see that revolution being captured by the military is sad, painful, and depressing. But I think there's a strong resistance in Sudan, so that the door is still open to reverse that, but it doesn't look very promising when you look at it from today. So I'll stop there. All of this to say is that the continent is going through a period of high stakes ferment, lots of worry, but it's also a very mixed picture as well. Thank you.
Of course, it is a mixed picture. Thank you, Errol. But Nina, as a more military minded or expert, why is the military in all these states being empowered, and why are they making these coups, do you think?
Right. So it's very difficult to answer for each of the states, but I think it's important to remember that this is not the first coup wave that the African continent is witnessing. Africa is the continent which has seen the most coups in the world, with 220 out of the 490 coups and coup attempts that have taken place globally since 1950. 220 have taken place on the African continent, and 109 of these have been successful. So there is a history of coup, and that's, of course, an important factor to why we see coups today, because one of the reasons that it's identified by research, the civil military research that looking into coups, is really the military centrality. That's one of the prime reasons to why there are coups in states globally. And in Africa, in particular, the military has a very central role in many states. One reason for this is the colonial legacy. So in many of the colonies, the colonizers built up a relatively strong military to be able to suppress the domestic opposition to the colonization. And that military stayed on as a very central actor after the colonization period. And many of the leaders who came into power after colonization period, they maintained the military as a strong institution because they wanted to stay in power. So they basically tried to buttress the military by giving them specific privileges or putting them in place in return for loyalty. So that meant that you had not very strong operational militaries, but you had militaries that were keen on keeping the regime in power. So let's say that the politics was militarized and the military was politicized. And I think that has stayed on in many of the African states that we see today. And we also know that once a state has a history of coup, the risk that they will have more coups is even more bigger. So, for example, as Comfort was already mentioning, Sudan has seen 17 coup attempts. So it's not something that's happening right now. Burkina Faso has the highest figure of successful coups with 9 coups, like 2023. So we're seeing these in states that already have a domestic history of coup, where the military already has a very central role to play in the states. And of course, that's reinforced by common threats. So Comfort was talking about how external actors have been involved in many of the states that have experienced coup during the past few years, fighting different types of non-state armed actors like jihadist groups. And once we have a common enemy between these African states and the external actors, whether they are Western actors or non-Western actors, that's of course also putting the militaries and the armed forces role even more prominent, because it means that this is seen as the solution to the problems or the security crisis, and that even that pushes the military to the front even more. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we see the coups, the military centrality in many of the African states. And why we're seeing them now is probably also related to a little bit what Comfort was alluding to, the great power competition that we now have especially since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, really have a strong competition between the Western state, however we define that, and the other states. And we can see that competition is really weakening the anti-coup norms more globally. It means that the norms that we set, they are deprioritized for the interests. So if we have security interests in a state, we're more likely to try to maintain that instead of condemning coups. And that goes for not just Western actors, but more globally. So I think these two aspects are important to remember when we talk about coups. So military centrality, which is privileged both by the regimes in power already wants to maintain their seat, but also by external actors who are promoting the military through different means. And then in combination with that, we then have the great power competition that's weakening many of the norms that we're normally trying to uphold.
Thank you both very much. And thank you, Nina. Just as an entire aside, which other continent has a high level of coups?
Right. So Latin America had a very high level of coups during the 1970s, but that has gone down after the democratization wave in the 1990s. Same goes for Africa. During the 2 decades before 2020, we also saw a decline of the number of coups. I think we had 39 coup attempts between 2000 and 2019. So there were fewer coup attempts, but they were more successful. And then from 2020 and onwards, we have more coup attempts and they're more successful. So if I'm calculating right, we have a success rate of about 64% for coup plotters in Africa today during the past 3 years. So that gives you an indication of why it's the cost-benefit analysis for coup plotters has really radically changed during the past few years. And just to finish on this, because I'm doing research on it right now, Comfort was mentioning the risk of the contagiousness of coups. So I think that it's important to say that each coup has its own rationale. There's always a domestic narrative behind each of the coups that we see, and they are not contagious in the sense that there is a domino falling. And there has been statistical research before on coups that are saying that there is no learning or emulation between coups. But that research was done before the latest coup wave. And what I'm trying to show in my research now is that there is actually learning and emulation between the coup leaders and the coup plotters, especially in the Sahel region. You were talking before about how France has been ousted in many of these states. And I think that between the three states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, I think that we can see that certain aspects have been repeated and copied between the coup leaders over the past 3 years, notably that they have been cutting support and collaboration with France very early on to gain more domestic support, and that they have tried to reach out to Russia in different forms or different ways. And also looking at how they have been treating ECOWAS, the West African Regional Organization, and how they've been dealing with ECOWAS condemnations and sanctions of the coups. I think that also shows that there has been some sort of learning between the coup leaders.
Just to say, because the focus really from what Nina's been providing has been on the military takeover of a country, but there's also been another interesting phenomena that's been taking place alongside of this. This is sort of unconstitutional change of term limits. I think that doesn't require or result in a military takeover. It just requires the leader, the incumbent, the regime, to tamper with the term limits of the constitution to extend power on the argument that the people want me, the people want me to stay in power, or for reasons to explain that the stability of the country needs to remain under my supervision. So a number of countries fall into that bracket. I think Ivory Coast, although it's worth qualifying that today Ivory Coast looks even better and leaner within the context that we're seeing in South Africa. But you are seeing what I would call electoral, or what we would call electoral authoritarianism. And there you can put Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, Zimbabwe, for example, all ended in a sort of a kind of regime where the presidents fix elections and change the constitution so they can serve beyond their mandated term limits. And Uganda, for example, is another good one. Rwanda is another good one. So I think it's worth sort of qualifying what we mean by coups, because some of them are coups in the classic military takeover, but there are some where the incumbent uses a democratic platform to get into power, but then tampers with that very process, the constitution, to extend their power, to maintain power, to hold onto power. And we're seeing a lot more of that on the continent alongside the classic military takeover. So I wanted to sort of inject that in Nina's very good historical.
I think that's an excellent point to inject. Again, for those who don't understand much about Africa, and even for those who do, I think we have here, it seems to me, just as a non-expert, you have issues of governance, because why is the level of governance so bad for people, and therefore it's easy to do these things?
Yeah, I mean, again, Nina raised a number of important big issues that I think we should sort of unpack them one by one, because in there she rightfully said there are domestic context matters in all of the stories that we have seen. And the most immediate one, so I think we don't have time to do a big sort of kaleidoscope of everything. But in each of the recent coups, for example, and let's narrow it down to the three in the Sahel and then Sudan, because those are the ones that really are at the center of everybody's concern. And each recent coup, for example, has a different, story, and it's driven by local problems. It's true, there is the sort of international context, but I don't think we should lose sight of the very local problems that these countries are facing as well. Now, some have emerged as a response to government failures, for example, to control Islamist militancy. This is very much the story of Mali. And in fact, the interesting thing about Mali is that there had been an unconstitutional sort of attempt to usurp governance in that country by Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, who was the president on the eve of the coup. Now, out of frustration with his performance, both governance and in terms of the Islamist militancy, a coup, the military stepped in to usurp him from power. Now, Nina rightfully mentioned ECOWAS. The interesting, and this is the regional body for West Africa, the interesting thing about Mali is that when ECOWAS decided to intervene and to protest the coup, the Malian people turned around and said, wait a minute, when there was a civilian attempt to usurp governance, i.e. to recognize or to delegitimize the vote in the Legislative Assembly, you did not step in then because we consider that a coup, but you step in when it's one of your own. And when it's one of your own heads of state, you step in to say that was a coup. So one could argue that the real coup in Mali had taken place long before the August 2020, because the president himself had undermined the Legislative Assembly at that time. But anyway, that's a Mali story.
But it's a fascinating story. And when you say that people rose up and said that, it just brings us slightly also to the issue of civil society. How does civil society function?
And it's interesting that in all of these three countries, so the French fact, we can't ignore the failed French intervention in Mali. I think that's part of the struggle, and that's part of the story behind the coup. But in all the three countries, civilians welcomed the coup. They welcomed the military, not because they are pro-military, not because they believe in the military regimes, but it was anger with civilian leaders. It was anger with the failure of what they promised, what they said democracy would promise as well. So if you look, and it was also anger with I would say, the unchecked Islamist violence, particularly in Mali and Burkina Faso, because in those two countries, the military, for example, was very much at the heart of the Islamist pushback. And yet they were also being held to account for the failure of government to provide the capacity for the military to fight. But what was really interesting about in these three countries is that the civilians themselves had come up to show their own frustration with governance in their country. And they were beginning to see that democracy, although they are still faithfully committed to the idea of democracy, they saw that it wasn't delivering in terms of basic livelihoods, in terms of public services, in terms of ending corruption. And in all three countries, corruption is at the heart of the matter. But Niger is slightly different, and so is Guinea. Guinea and Gabon, for example, are interesting because they had nothing to do with Islamist militancy. That was not a factor. But these were countries that had suffered under erratic dictators for decades, elected presidents moving to cling on to power when it was clear that they had to step down, and when it was clear that the electoral outcome was not in their favor, and that prompted a military intervention. For example, in Gabon, that was blatantly rigged elections by a weakened long-time ruler, and that provided impotence for change. In fact, it's a family coup in a sense. And then the one we haven't talked about is another interesting coup that happened in Chad in 2021, when military leaders there used the opportunity opened up by the death of the longtime ruler to then appoint the son of Deby. So Deby 1 was replaced by Deby 2, the son, who headed the military council. And then he reneged on his promise, provide a limited stay in power. And now he's in power. So each context is different. The civil society is there either as a counterweight or sort of rallying behind the military. But in rallying behind the military, we mustn't assume that they favor the military, but they see that right now the civilian leaders are not providing the answer that they need in terms of governance, instead in terms of livelihood issues as well.
You know, when you're an expert on external military interventions, when you see an external military intervention being mounted, do you think there's any awareness at all of all these absolutely fascinating differences and the fact that the military is favored, but only in relation to a more corrupt political leader?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there is limited understanding from external actors about exactly the local context in many of these situations. In some contexts, in some situations, there's more, of course, depending on who the external actors are. I think I just wanted to jump in a little bit about what Comfort was saying earlier about these unconstitutional changes of government and how there are quite a few leaders who are evading the term limits and are changing the constitution through some sort of imposed referendums. And the Africa Center for Strategic Studies just did a research that's quite interesting that shows that many of the leaders who have evaded term limits, like Comfort said, they have come to power through a military coup or through military support or through a civil conflict. So you can see that leaders who have gained powers through these extra constitutional norms or means, they tend to continue to violate legal constraints on their time in power. So they're feeding into each other, let's say, the unconstitutional changes of government and the coups. So that means that we have quite a few leaders on the continent who are keen to stay in power. And as Comfort said, already in Chad, the transition period has become longer. And we've seen that in many of the states that have experienced coup recently, they set out a transition period, and that transition period is just extended, and the conditions are changed so that they can ultimately be elected to stay in power further on. And I was also thinking when Comfort was speaking about the popular support for the coups in the region, and I agree with Comfort that there have been popular support in both Mali and Burkina Faso. In Mali, it was very much a popular demonstrations that preceded the coup in August 2020, so the first coup in Mali that took place then. Because the corruption of the previous president, Ibeka. And in Burkina Faso, there was the whole jihadist element where the armed forces felt that they weren't protected enough by the political leadership, or that there were quite a few casualties in the armed forces and the security forces that was really mounting it towards the pressure against the political leadership that was seen as corrupt and not sufficiently engaged in protecting its own armed forces. In Niger, I think, just as Comfort was pointing out, the situation was a bit different, because there we had a President Bassoum, that came after almost a decade of a quite corrupt, I would say, regime or a government with the President Issoufou, and Bassoum was then seen as the new president, trying to change let's say try to get back to the corruption, or try to handle the corruption in a different way. So there wasn't any popular demonstrations against President Bassoum before the coup, even though we could see that there was support in the capital after the coup took place. It was not at all to the same extent as in Burkina Faso or Mali. So I think that the context is very different in these cases, as Comfort pointed out. But of course, governance is at the heart of the problem in each of the states that we've seen coups in.
Ileana, you asked an interesting question about the external. And I think, when we began, and Nina, you started to say something interesting about the international context. I think what we should bear in mind is the timing of when these coups happened. So we've sort of laid out the land in terms of the local context. But these coups were also happening not just in a moment of high stakes geopolitical tensions internationally, not just happening at the time where Russia appeared to be taking advantage of sort of French troubles in the Sahel. It also, yes, there's Russia's sort of 2022 invasion of Ukraine, but on the eve of all of these things was also two important factors that I think Africa has also been caught up with. So there's the sort of the turmoil of recent global shocks around Ukraine and the fallout, around sanctions, around food insecurity, about energy prices. But this was also taking place at a time when the continent was coming out of another shock, i.e. COVID pandemic as well. And I don't think we should forget that over the past few years, the economies had been battered by COVID-19, and that Africa itself had suffered as a result of that. So it was coming out of that shock. And at the same time as, recovering from that was having to deal with elevated food prices that many countries were trying to revive their economies. And then Ukraine happened as well. So a number of them had fallen into tremendous trouble. But also, I think the other thing that it's worth bearing in mind, you had the whole climate adaptation and financing and the monies that were promised not being delivered. And these are countries that have got suffering now today from sort of sovereign debt crisis, soaring inflation, and climate change driven catastrophe. So when you add all of these together, plus the local context and the pressures and the weakness of regimes not delivering on the promises around democracy, then you begin to understand that there are deeper roots into these crises and into these conflicts that explain why some countries, and I really want to underline, some countries are susceptible to coups, because not every country that faces these crises lands into this kind of trouble. So in the same West Africa region, there are two other countries that are in a precarious situation, Ghana and Nigeria. Ghana facing real sort of debt, economic burden pressures. Nigeria facing soaring inflation. And yet neither of those two countries have been susceptible to coups as well. So I think that's why that local domestic factor becomes crucial in understanding why one as opposed to the other as well.
Well, one thing is becoming absolutely clear, which is we need to do a series of podcasts on Africa and not try and do everything all at once. But nonetheless, an issue that keeps coming up from both of you in different ways is the external factor. We haven't spoken China, we haven't spoken Russia, and as a default, in any case, Europe, US, UN have been there for quite some time. Why is Africa so appealing to China and Russia lately?
Sure. Well, it's not just lately that Africa has been interesting for China and Russia. I think China has been involved in Africa during decades. This dates back long before the last 2 decades, but specifically, let's say after 2000, we have seen an increased investment by China in Africa, and we also know that China has been an actor that has provided a lot of infrastructure to many African states, and we have the Global Belt Road Initiative in Africa by China that has also, of course, emphasized the infrastructure aspect of China's engagement on the continent. Now I'm just painting the broad lines. And for Russia's part, we can see that there has been an increased engagement by Russia since their different interventions in neighboring states, in Georgia, and especially then since Ukraine, because as Russia has become more and more isolated on the global scene by other actors, including the Western one, and as they have now considerable sanctions against them, they have tried to reach out to other actors, and the African continent has been the place where they have really tried to increase their engagement in different ways. But I think we shouldn't overestimate Russia's influence on the African continent. It's a topic that's attracting a lot of media attention, but in comparison to other external actors, Russia has a very limited role on the continent. What's interesting with Russia is that they have managed to play a little bit above their weight. Let's say that they have managed to use their the mercenaries, the Wagner group, whatever we can call it now. Let's continue to call it the Wagner group. These Russian mercenaries that have been sent into different states in some sort of domestic turbulence or in some sort of armed conflict. So we have seen in Mali, but also in the Central African Republic, in Mozambique, and in Sudan. Even though we're talking about a very small amount of troops, they have managed to get a lot of attention from the media and from external actors that have in some way increased their importance above their own weight. So Russia is known as the actor that has the Kalashnikov diplomacy in Africa more broadly, because it's the main arms exporter to the continent. I think it's about 49% of all the arms in Africa comes from Russia. But apart from that, Russia is not a big actor in the African continent. They're not a strong economic actor. They're definitely not a strong development actor. Politically, they're gaining some inroads now during the past few years with certain states, but not many states. And I think that Russia's influence on the continent is a bit overemphasized, especially by certain media.
Thanks, Nina. I mean, there's not much else to add. There is a story, particularly during the Cold War, about how Moscow and Washington sort of made Africa sort of like a proxy battleground in the whole sort of geopolitical superpower era, and very much instigating or fueling wars, but also trying to shape politics in these countries. I think economically speaking, a number of African countries received generous support from Western governments or Western-dominated international institutions in exchange for not running towards Moscow's embrace in the Cold War. And it's interesting how we've sort of seen a repeat of history playing out. And when that sort of Cold War era ended, Africa was plunged into sort of a period of political turmoil, of economic uncertainty. And the question was, where would the role of the Western countries, where would the role of the sort of IFIs, the institutional financial players in all of this? And the reason I say that is because if you want to understand China's rise, you also have to understand the decline or the absence or the retreat, both of the Northern Hemisphere countries who, in a sense, I wouldn't go as far as to say they cut off financial support, but they made it harder for Africa to access some of those loans and to deal with its own debt issues. And also the conditions that were tied to some of these loans required a number of African governments to sort of go through painful market reforms. And then you saw China's rise, and you saw China coming in with, no conditions are tied to their aid, no conditions are tied to their debt. And suddenly, one of the most interesting things that I think accompanied the last decade or, of the 21st century was suddenly Africa saw that it had choices. It found that it was an interesting playing ground for great power competition. It found that it could turn to the West, but it could also look east to China. And at the same time, there were a number of sort of newer rising powers, Turkey being an interesting one, India, who traditionally had roles on the continent, but they then became interested players. So if you remember, a few years ago, Turkey said it was going to open, I think, 33 or so embassies. And with every embassy, Turkish Alliance came, Turkish Airways came on board. And so suddenly it wasn't just your classical diplomacy, it was airplane diplomacy, because suddenly it meant that we could fly to different places through Turkey. And then another set of actors, dormant actors, that has traditionally played a role, but then reasserted themselves in this multipolar era, was not just China, but it was also a number of Gulf countries. So you had the Gulf monarchies, and then you had Brazil as well. So this is the era of the BRICS, the era of the sort of rising monarchies, who therefore showed that Africa didn't no longer feel emboldened or needing to bend to Western demands for democracy, but they could look elsewhere. So you had this real interesting contest, interesting sort of players who now come to assert themselves. But one of the worrying things about that, and this will be the final thing that I'll say, is that some of those sort of middle powers, assertive powers, they started feeding new conflicts by supplying arms to their favored leaders, to various factions in various areas, and therefore widened and broadened that geostrategic interest, but then also complicated peacemaking on the continent. So a lot of commercial interest at a time where Africa was maturing, Africa rising, it had lots of choices. But a number of those players also taking decisions that either fueled conflicts, made it harder to end conflicts, but were also showing that there were new mediators who could help find a way in which to end conflicts. I think right now what we're watching is whether those actors, those Gulf monarchies, particularly Saudi Arabia, can help us find a pathway to peace in Sudan, for example. And Saudi Arabia has led the peace talks or efforts to get to peace, efforts to get to a negotiated settlement, for example, in Sudan, in Jeddah. Where that ends up, we don't know. But all of this to say is that the continent is very different today. There are a number of actors today. I think you're very right to say, Nina, that I think Russia, people are overstating Russia's influence. It's certainly opportunistic, but there's no clear where it's sort of, whether there's coherence in its foreign policy tactics. But there's clearly interest on the continent, and how that helps sort of drive towards a peaceful coexistence for a number of regions is going to be the thing that we're going to be watching for the next few months, I think.
I think you're probably right. And even though we're out of time, I will ask one last short question, which is, looking at all these external actors, looking at everything you've told us so fascinatingly about Africa, how does it see its role, if at all, in unfolding global events?
Oh, it's brilliant question. The Africa Union sits at the apex of, sort of the political view of the continent, and one would assume that it would shape a lot of the thinking in terms of international affairs. But what we've seen in the last sort of 18 months, particularly in Ukraine, but now in relation to Israel, Gaza, is that there are individual countries who have sort of staked their own claim in terms of their views on a number of sort of international dramas. So South Africa very much wanting to kind of play a mediation role, but its own complicated history of the African National Congress vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, I think made it struggle in terms of where it sat alongside Russia, Ukraine, and its understanding of what was going on there. And then you had the very interesting position of the then Kenyan ambassador to the UN, who made it very clear on the eve of the invasion that he was very concerned about multilateralism. And that this House, this chamber, this Security Council needed to work hard to preserve the essence of the UN principles. There's been an assumption that somehow Africa has been in bed or closer to Russia. I think that's a fallacy. I think that is to misunderstand the varied relationships. There's certain countries for regime survival, for military survival, who felt the need to be in the camp of Russia, but there are others who have been supportive of Ukraine. And then despite the abstention at the UN, I think they've all charted a course that speaks directly to their own national interests. It's the national interests, it's the economic interests of these countries that dictates where they sit in Ukraine. But I would also say that it's the same thing, not surprisingly, for Israel, Palestine, where you've seen the tilt generally from a number of African countries because of their own colonial history to be very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, not necessarily undermining the need for or recognizing the need for Israel's self-defense as well, but being very clear, at least from South Africa's perspective, it's not lost to any of us that the language of apartheid in South Africa resonates very strongly when you lay it into the Israel-Palestine conundrum as well.
At least with this current government. Nina, do you have anything to add?
I think that it's important to remember that we talk about Africa as a continent, and you mentioned it in the beginning, but of course it's 54 different states. So we also need to remember this, and we shouldn't speak about it as one coherent country. That being said, I think that the AU is struggling to have a global role. It's struggling because there are internal divisions within the continent.
African Union.
Yes, African Union is struggling. But the Ukraine war has, in some ways, even though there have been internal division within the continent, the AU has taken on a role where I think it's the first time since Iraq in 2003 that the AU is actually speaking on behalf of the continent, apart from the annual comments about the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's the first time that they actually have speaking on behalf of the continent. So in some ways, they are trying to carve out a global role for the African Union in spite of the internal tensions that Comfort was alluding to earlier. So in some ways, you can also see that Africa is really picking up on the agency, on its agency to play a role in these events. And I think it's important to remember that this is not something new. African states have always played a role, even during the Cold War, when we talk about the African continent as a playground for the superpowers, that they have always been part of it. It's always been leaders who have playing into this. It's never been passive continent or passive leaders or states. It's always been part of the international relations as we speak and as we see them develop. And even so, even more so now during the global power competition that we're witnessing, because again, we see that the leaders from the different states are pulling and pushing African leaders in different directions. But we shouldn't forget that these leaders are as strategic as the other actors, as the superpowers, if we call them superpowers, as they are. So not to forget that the African states, they are very well aware of what they want and how they're voting. And they're also knowing that they have this possibility to go in both directions.
By the way, next year is going to be quite significant because, you'll recall that this year, India, President Modi sees himself as the head of the global South. It was under his watch that the African Union was brought into the family of the G20. Now, what the African Union and what the African member states do with this new role, I think is something that we're all going to be watching as observers as well. And whether the Union can represent all 54 states is also something we're going to be keeping an eye on. That is quite a significant triumph, and congratulations for that happening. But it's going to be interesting to see if we can get a coherent approach to having that membership on the G20. But it's a welcome decision as well.
It's not only a welcome decision, it's the reason that at the very least we're going to have the two of you back on next year to assess how well the African Union did in the G20. Thank you both so very much. That's a wrap on this episode of Wise Brussels Voices. Thank you again to our guests, Iro Comfort and Nina Villen. We'd also like to thank our technical team at Free Range Productions. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. We're on all media as Wise Brussels, so reach out on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and even TikTok. Learn more about Wise Brussels on our website, wise-brussels.org. I'm Ilana Beitel with my friend, colleague, producer, Florence Ferrando, and we will be back very soon with another great conversation.